Question 1. Compliance review shows an applicant for a permit to carry a concealed handgun, CCH, is being evaluated on their understanding of risk assessment. Which of the following approaches best demonstrates a responsible and legally compliant understanding of risk assessment when carrying a concealed handgun in Colorado? Option A. Relying on assumptions about individuals' intentions based on their appearance or behavior to preemptively assess risk. Option B. Focusing on the legal right to carry and being prepared for immediate physical confrontation if any perceived threat arises. Option C. Prioritizing situational awareness, recognizing potential threats, and actively seeking to de-escalate or avoid conflict before considering the use of a firearm. Option D. Concealing the firearm but being ready to display it prominently as a deterrent if feeling uncomfortable in a public space. Correct answer is C. Prioritizing situational awareness, recognizing potential threats, and actively seeking to de-escalate or avoid conflict before considering the use of a firearm. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an applicant to demonstrate a nuanced understanding of risk assessment in the context of carrying a concealed handgun, going beyond mere memorization of laws. It tests their ability to apply legal principles to real-world situations, considering potential threats and their own capabilities and limitations. The applicant must balance the right to self-defense with the responsibility to act lawfully and avoid unnecessary escalation or endangerment of others. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves a proactive and comprehensive assessment of the environment and potential threats, prioritizing de-escalation and avoidance of conflict whenever possible. This includes recognizing subtle indicators of danger, understanding personal limitations, and having a clear plan for self-defense that prioritizes minimizing harm to oneself and innocent bystanders. This approach aligns with the spirit of Colorado's concealed carry laws, which emphasize responsible gun ownership and the prevention of violence. It reflects an ethical commitment to public safety and a mature understanding of the gravity of carrying a firearm. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach focuses solely on the legal right to carry and the immediate physical confrontation, neglecting the crucial elements of situational awareness and de-escalation. This demonstrates a potentially dangerous overemphasis on the use of force as the primary response, failing to consider the legal and ethical ramifications of escalating a situation unnecessarily. It overlooks the responsibility to avoid conflict when possible, which is a cornerstone of responsible concealed carry. Another incorrect approach involves relying on assumptions about others' intentions or capabilities without concrete evidence. This can lead to misjudgments and potentially trigger a defensive response in a situation that might not have been inherently dangerous. It fails to engage in a thorough risk assessment, instead substituting speculation for observation and analysis, which is a significant ethical and practical failing. A third incorrect approach prioritizes the display of the firearm as a deterrent without considering the potential for it to provoke an aggressive response or create panic. This demonstrates a lack of understanding of how the presence of a firearm can alter a situation and potentially escalate it, rather than de-escalate it. It overlooks the responsibility to carry discreetly and only reveal the firearm when absolutely necessary for self-defense. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of applicable laws and regulations. This framework should then incorporate principles of situational awareness, threat assessment, and de-escalation techniques. Before considering the use of a firearm, professionals must exhaust all reasonable options for avoiding conflict. This includes maintaining a safe distance, verbally de-escalating, and seeking to disengage from potentially dangerous situations. The decision to draw or use a firearm should be a last resort, based on a clear and imminent threat of death or serious bodily harm, and always with consideration for the safety of innocent third parties. Continuous training and self-reflection on judgment and decision-making under stress are also vital components of responsible concealed carry. Question 2. Process analysis reveals that a permit holder for carrying a concealed handgun in Colorado encounters an individual who is verbally aggressive and blocking their path, but not physically threatening or brandishing a weapon. The permit holder feels increasingly anxious. Which of the following actions best aligns with the legal and ethical responsibilities of a concealed handgun permit holder in this situation? Option A. Engage in a verbal argument with the aggressive individual to assert dominance and resolve the confrontation. Option B. Maintain a calm demeanor, Assess the situation for any imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury, and if no such threat exists, attempt to de-escalate or create distance from the aggressive individual. Option C. Display the concealed handgun to intimidate the aggressive individual and encourage them to move. Option D. Immediately draw the concealed handgun and prepare to use it, believing the verbal aggression indicates a potential for future harm. Correct answer is B. Maintain a calm demeanor. Assess the situation for any imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury, and if no such threat exists, attempt to de-escalate or create distance from the aggressive individual. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to balance their right to self-defense with the significant legal responsibilities and potential liabilities associated with carrying a concealed handgun. The core difficulty lies in accurately assessing a situation's immediate threat level and determining if the use of deadly force is legally justifiable and ethically sound, all while operating under the strictures of Colorado law. Misjudgment can lead to severe legal consequences, including criminal charges and civil lawsuits, as well as profound ethical repercussions. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves a thorough and objective assessment of the immediate threat to life or serious bodily harm. This means evaluating the totality of circumstances, including the aggressor's actions, intent, capability, and proximity, to determine if there is an imminent danger that cannot be avoided by other means. Colorado Revised Statutes C.R.S. Section 18-1-704 outlines the justifiable use of physical force, including deadly physical force, when a person reasonably believes it is necessary to prevent imminent death or serious bodily injury to themselves or another person. This approach prioritizes de-escalation and avoidance where possible, resorting to the use of a firearm only as a last resort when legally and ethically mandated by the immediate threat. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to rely solely on a subjective feeling of fear or unease without concrete evidence of an imminent threat. While fear is a natural response, Colorado law requires a reasonable belief based on objective circumstances. Acting solely on a generalized sense of danger, without specific actions by another person demonstrating intent to cause death or serious bodily harm, would not meet the legal standard for justifiable use of deadly force and could lead to criminal charges. Another incorrect approach is to assume that any perceived slight or aggressive behavior from another individual automatically justifies the use of a concealed handgun. Colorado law does not permit the use of deadly force for retaliation, punishment, or to prevent minor offenses. Escalating a situation beyond what is necessary to neutralize an immediate threat, or using a firearm in response to non-life-threatening aggression, would be a violation of the law and ethical principles. A third incorrect approach is to brandish or display a concealed handgun as a warning or intimidation tactic when no immediate threat exists. This action itself can be considered an assault or menacing under Colorado law, and it escalates a situation unnecessarily, potentially provoking a dangerous response from the other party and creating liability for the permit holder. The permit to carry a concealed handgun is for defensive purposes, not for asserting dominance or resolving disputes. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes threat assessment, legal compliance, and ethical responsibility. This involves 1. Situational awareness, continuously observing the environment and identifying potential threats. 2. Threat evaluation, objectively assessing the nature, imminence, and severity of any perceived threat, considering the aggressor's actions, intent, and capability. 3. De-escalation and avoidance, prioritizing nonviolent means to resolve conflict or escape the situation whenever feasible and safe. 4. Legal justification, understanding and applying the specific legal standards for the use of force, particularly deadly force, as defined by Colorado law. 5. Ethical considerations, acting with restraint and responsibility, recognizing the profound consequences of using deadly force. This systematic approach ensures that any action taken is legally defensible, ethically sound, and proportionate to the threat. Question 3. Consider a scenario where an individual carrying a concealed handgun is involved in a heated verbal argument in a public place. The other party becomes increasingly agitated, raises their voice, and takes a step towards the individual in an aggressive manner, clenching their fists. What is the most appropriate course of action for the concealed handgun permit holder? Option A. Respond verbally with equally aggressive language and gestures to assert dominance and deter further aggression. Option B. Disengage from the argument by walking away and seeking a safe distance, even if it means leaving the immediate vicinity of the confrontation. Option C. Immediately draw the concealed handgun to intimidate the other party and de-escalate the situation by showing readiness to defend oneself. Option D. Assess the situation for an imminent threat of death or serious bodily harm, considering the other party's actions and intent, and if such a threat is reasonably perceived and no safe retreat is available, consider drawing or using the concealed handgun. The correct answer is D. Assess the situation for an imminent threat of death or serious bodily harm, considering the other party's actions and intent, and if such a threat is reasonably perceived and no safe retreat is available, consider drawing or using the concealed handgun. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to balance their right to self-defense with the legal and ethical responsibilities associated with carrying a concealed handgun. The core of the challenge lies in accurately assessing a threat and determining if the use of deadly force is justified under Colorado law, specifically the Colorado Self-Defense Act, C.R.S. Section 18-1-704. Misjudgment can lead to severe legal consequences, including criminal charges and ethical repercussions. The individual must understand the nuances of imminent danger and the proportionality of force. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves a thorough and objective assessment of the immediate circumstances, focusing on whether there is an imminent threat of death or serious bodily harm. This requires considering the aggressor's actions, words, and apparent intent, as well as the physical environment. If such a threat is reasonably perceived, and there is no safe avenue of retreat, as per Colorado law, which generally does not impose a duty to retreat in one's home, but may in other locations depending on the circumstances, then drawing or using the concealed handgun may be justified. This approach aligns with the legal standard of self-defense, emphasizing reasonable belief of imminent danger and the necessity of force to prevent serious harm. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to draw or use the concealed handgun based solely on a feeling of unease or a perceived insult, without a concrete, imminent threat of death or serious bodily harm. This fails to meet the legal threshold for self-defense under Colorado law, which requires more than mere apprehension or annoyance. Such an action would likely be considered an unlawful display of a weapon or assault, as it lacks the necessary justification of imminent danger. Another incorrect approach is to refrain from using the concealed handgun even when facing an imminent threat of death or serious bodily harm, due to fear or uncertainty about legal repercussions. A caution is warranted. A complete failure to act when legally justified and necessary to prevent serious harm could have tragic consequences and may not be legally defensible if the individual could have reasonably acted to protect themselves. Colorado law permits the use of deadly force when a person reasonably believes it is necessary to prevent imminent death or serious bodily injury. A further incorrect approach is to escalate a verbal dispute into a physical confrontation and then resort to using the concealed handgun. Colorado law, like most jurisdictions, does not permit the use of deadly force to resolve non-lethal disputes or to retaliate for insults or minor altercations. The force used must be proportional to the threat faced, and initiating or escalating a conflict negates the justification for self-defense. Professional reasoning. Professionals carrying a concealed handgun should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes de-escalation and avoidance of conflict. And confronted with a potential threat, the primary consideration should be: 1. Is there an imminent threat of death or serious bodily harm? 2. Is there a safe avenue of retreat where applicable? 3. If force is necessary, is it proportional to the threat? This framework, grounded in Colorado's self-defense statutes, emphasizes a rational, objective assessment of the situation rather than an emotional or reactive response. Continuous training in situational awareness, threat assessment, and the legal parameters of force is crucial for responsible concealed carry. Question 4. During the evaluation of a crowded public space, a permit holder observes an individual exhibiting increasingly agitated behavior and making aggressive verbalizations towards another person. The permit holder feels a sense of unease and perceives a potential for escalation. What is the most prudent course of action to uphold both their right to carry and their responsibility for safe conduct? Option A. Ignore the individual's behavior and continue with their current activity, assuming the situation will resolve itself without intervention. Option B. Confront the agitated individual verbally to de-escalate the situation by asserting their presence and demanding they cease their behavior. Option C. Immediately draw their concealed handgun to signal their readiness to defend themselves, thereby deterring further aggression. Option D. Discreetly assess the situation for escape routes, and, if possible, calmly and quietly move away from the area of potential conflict, maintaining situational awareness without direct engagement. The correct answer is D. Discreetly assess the situation for escape routes, and, if possible, calmly and quietly move away from the area of potential conflict, maintaining situational awareness without direct engagement. Explanation. The scenario presents a common challenge for permit holders, balancing the right to carry with the responsibility to avoid escalating potentially volatile situations. The professional challenge lies in accurately assessing risk and making a judgment call that prioritizes safety and legal compliance without resorting to unnecessary displays of force or confrontation. The permit holder must consider not only their immediate safety, but also the potential legal ramifications of their actions and the broader implications for responsible gun ownership. The best approach involves a proactive, de-escalatory strategy that prioritizes avoidance and minimizes the need for any defensive action. This means assessing the environment for potential threats, identifying escape routes, and, if confronted, clearly and calmly communicating a desire to disengage. The legal and ethical justification for this approach stems from Colorado Revised Statutes C.R.S. Section 18-12-109, which outlines the permissible use of a concealed handgun. While the statute grants the right to carry, it does not mandate or encourage its use in situations that can be resolved through non-confrontational means. Ethical considerations also strongly favor de-escalation, as the responsible use of a firearm includes avoiding its use whenever possible. An incorrect approach would be to immediately draw the firearm upon perceiving a potential threat, even if that threat is not imminent or overt. This action, while potentially perceived as protective by some, significantly escalates the situation and could be interpreted as aggressive rather than defensive, potentially violating the spirit, if not the letter, of the law regarding the lawful use of force. Furthermore, it bypasses opportunities for de-escalation and could lead to unintended consequences. Another incorrect approach is to ignore the perceived threat entirely and continue with one's activities without any situational awareness or contingency planning. While avoiding confrontation is generally good, complete obliviousness to a potentially dangerous situation is irresponsible. A permit holder has a duty to be aware of their surroundings and to take reasonable steps to ensure their safety and the safety of others, which may include discreetly moving away from a developing problem. Finally, engaging verbally with the aggressor in a confrontational or challenging manner, even without drawing a weapon, is also an inappropriate response. This can quickly escalate a tense situation into a physical altercation, negating the benefits of concealed carry and potentially putting the permit holder in a position where they might feel compelled to use their firearm defensively, which is a last resort. The professional decision-making process in such situations should involve a rapid, multifaceted risk assessment. This includes identifying the nature and proximity of the perceived threat, evaluating potential escape routes, considering the presence of other individuals, and assessing one's own emotional state. The primary goal should always be to safely disengage from the situation if possible. If direct confrontation is unavoidable, the response should be proportionate to the threat and guided by the legal framework for self-defense, always prioritizing de-escalation and the avoidance of lethal force. Question 5. The assessment process reveals a scenario where an individual is approached in a dimly lit parking lot by another person who is speaking aggressively and gesturing with their hands, but not overtly displaying a weapon. The individual carrying a concealed handgun feels a surge of anxiety and a strong intuition that they are in danger. What is the most appropriate course of action based on Colorado's legal framework for the justifiable use of force? Option A. Use the concealed handgun to create distance and deter the aggressive individual, even if no weapon is visible and the threat is not clearly imminent, to ensure personal safety. Option B. Focus on the aggressive individual's body language and vocal tone, assuming that such aggression inherently constitutes an imminent threat justifying immediate defensive action. Option C. Assess if the aggressive individual's actions create a reasonable belief of imminent death or serious bodily harm, prioritizing de-escalation and avoidance if safe to do so, before considering any defensive action. Option D. Immediately draw the concealed handgun and prepare to use it, given the aggressive demeanor and the feeling of anxiety, as a proactive measure against potential harm. The correct answer is C. Assess if the aggressive individual's actions create a reasonable belief of imminent death or serious bodily harm, prioritizing de-escalation and avoidance if safe to do so, before considering any defensive action. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to balance their right to self-defense with the legal obligations and responsibilities associated with carrying a concealed handgun. The core challenge lies in accurately assessing a situation to determine if the use of deadly force is legally justified and ethically sound, while also considering the potential consequences of their actions and the impact on public safety. Misjudgment can lead to severe legal repercussions, including criminal charges and ethical condemnation. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough and objective assessment of the immediate threat to life or serious bodily harm. This approach prioritizes de-escalation and avoidance of conflict whenever safely possible. If confronted with a situation where deadly force appears necessary, the individual must be able to articulate, based on reasonable belief, that they are in imminent danger of death or serious bodily injury. This aligns with Colorado Revised Statutes, CRS. Section 18-1-704, which outlines the justifiable use of physical force, including deadly physical force, when a person reasonably believes it is necessary to defend themselves or another against the imminent use of unlawful physical force. The focus is on the objective reasonableness of the belief of imminent danger, not on subjective feelings or past grievances. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to rely on a subjective feeling of unease or a general sense of being threatened without a concrete, imminent danger. This fails to meet the legal standard of imminent threat required for the justifiable use of deadly force under Colorado law. It can lead to an overreaction to perceived threats that do not pose a genuine risk of death or serious bodily harm, potentially resulting in unlawful use of force. Another incorrect approach is to assume that the mere presence of a weapon or a perceived aggressive stance from another individual automatically justifies the use of deadly force. Colorado law requires more than just a perceived threat. It demands an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury. This approach ignores the legal nuances and the requirement for a reasonable belief of immediate danger. A further incorrect approach is to use deadly force to prevent property damage or to apprehend a fleeing suspect who does not pose an immediate threat to life. Colorado law strictly limits the use of deadly force to situations involving the defense of life or prevention of serious bodily harm, not for the protection of property or for actions that do not involve an imminent threat. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that emphasizes situational awareness, threat assessment, and adherence to legal statutes. This involves actively observing the environment, identifying potential threats, and evaluating the imminence and severity of any danger. When faced with a potentially dangerous situation, the primary goal should be to disengage or de-escalate if safely possible. If the use of force becomes unavoidable, the decision to use deadly force must be based on a clear, objective, and reasonable belief that it is necessary to prevent imminent death or serious bodily harm, in strict accordance with Colorado law. Continuous training and understanding of legal parameters are crucial for responsible firearm carriers. Question 6. Stakeholder feedback indicates a need for clearer understanding of the scope of authority granted by a Colorado permit to carry a concealed handgun, CCH. An individual holding a valid CCH permit observes a driver committing a minor traffic infraction, such as failing to signal a lane change. The permit holder feels a general sense of unease about the driver's behavior. What is the most appropriate course of action for the permit holder in this situation? Option A. Disengage from the situation and do not intervene, as the CCH permit does not grant authority to enforce traffic laws or act on generalized unease. Option B. Display the concealed handgun to the driver as a warning, believing that the presence of the weapon will deter future infractions and address the perceived threat. Option C. Approach the driver and inform them of their traffic violation, asserting the authority granted by the CCH permit to ensure compliance. Option D. Intervene by attempting to pull the driver over or block their vehicle, considering the CCH permit as a mandate to uphold traffic laws when law enforcement is not present. Correct answer is A. Disengage from the situation and do not intervene, as the CCH permit does not grant authority to enforce traffic laws or act on generalized unease. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves a direct conflict between a citizen's right to self-defense and the legal requirements for carrying a concealed handgun. The individual's perceived threat, while real to them, must be assessed against objective legal standards and the specific provisions of Colorado law regarding permits to carry. Misinterpreting the scope of the permit or the conditions under which it is valid can lead to serious legal consequences, including the revocation of the permit and potential criminal charges. The core challenge lies in applying the legal framework to a dynamic, potentially stressful personal situation. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice is to strictly adhere to the conditions and limitations outlined in the Colorado Concealed Handgun Permit, CCH, statute and associated regulations. This means understanding that a CCH permit authorizes the concealed carry of a handgun by a qualified individual, but it does not grant the permit holder the authority to act as a law enforcement officer or to engage in proactive enforcement of laws. The permit holder's right to carry is contingent upon remaining in compliance with all applicable laws, including those governing the use of force and the circumstances under which a concealed handgun may be displayed or used. Therefore, the correct approach involves recognizing that the permit does not authorize the individual to intervene in a situation that does not directly and immediately threaten their own safety or the safety of others in a manner that legally justifies the use of deadly force. The permit holder must assess the situation based on their immediate personal safety and the legal standards for self-defense, not on a perceived duty to enforce minor infractions. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to believe that a CCH permit grants the holder the authority to stop individuals for minor traffic violations or other non-threatening offenses. This fundamentally misunderstands the purpose of the permit, which is for personal protection, not for law enforcement. Engaging in such actions could be construed as impersonating a law enforcement officer or exceeding the authority granted by the permit, leading to legal repercussions. Another incorrect approach is to assume that any perceived threat, regardless of its immediacy or severity, justifies the display or use of a concealed handgun. Colorado law, like all self-defense laws, requires that the threat be imminent and that the force used be reasonable and necessary. A CCH permit does not alter these fundamental legal principles. Acting on a generalized feeling of unease or a minor inconvenience without an immediate, credible threat to life or serious bodily harm is a violation of the law and ethical conduct for a permit holder. A further incorrect approach is to interpret the permit as a license to carry a handgun in any location or circumstance, irrespective of specific prohibitions. While a CCH permit generally allows for concealed carry, there are specific locations and situations where carrying a handgun is prohibited by law, regardless of permit status. Failing to be aware of and adhere to these prohibitions is a failure to comply with the legal framework governing concealed carry. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this field must adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance and ethical conduct. This involves a continuous process of self-education regarding the specific statutes and regulations governing concealed carry in Colorado. When faced with a situation, the professional must first assess their own immediate safety and the imminence of any threat. They must then consider whether their actions are legally justifiable under the principles of self-defense and whether they are acting within the scope of their CCH permit. If there is any doubt about the legality or appropriateness of an action, the professional should err on the side of caution, disengage from the situation, and, if necessary, contact law enforcement. The permit is a privilege, not a license to act outside the law. Question 7. Market research demonstrates that individuals carrying concealed handguns often face complex scenarios where their perception of threat can be influenced by various factors. Considering the legal framework for carrying a concealed handgun in Colorado, Which of the following represents the most responsible and legally sound approach to managing potential risks in public spaces? Option A. Assume a defensive posture and be prepared to engage any individual who exhibits behavior that could be interpreted as aggressive or suspicious, regardless of whether an immediate threat is present. Option B. Focus on projecting an image of authority and readiness to use the firearm, thereby deterring potential threats through visible preparedness and a willingness to confront perceived dangers. Option C. Rely on personal intuition and past experiences to preemptively assess individuals for potential danger, intervening if a person's presence or actions seem out of place or potentially threatening. Option D. Maintain a heightened state of awareness of surroundings, actively identify potential hazards, and prioritize de-escalation and avoidance of conflict, only considering the use of a firearm as a last resort against an imminent threat of death or serious bodily harm. The correct answer is D. Maintain a heightened state of awareness of surroundings, actively identify potential hazards, and prioritize de-escalation and avoidance of conflict, only considering the use of a firearm as a last resort against an imminent threat of death or serious bodily harm. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to balance their right to self-defense with the legal and ethical responsibilities associated with carrying a concealed handgun. The core of the challenge lies in accurately assessing a situation for potential threats without succumbing to fear or prejudice, and understanding the precise legal boundaries of when and how force may be used. Careful judgment is required to distinguish between a genuine, imminent threat and a situation that may be de-escalated or avoided through non-violent means. The best professional approach involves a proactive and objective assessment of the environment and individuals within it, prioritizing de-escalation and avoidance of conflict. This means remaining aware of surroundings, identifying potential hazards, and actively seeking to disengage from situations that appear volatile or dangerous. Legal justification for carrying a concealed handgun in Colorado is primarily for self-defense against imminent threats of death or serious bodily harm. This approach aligns with that justification by focusing on preventing the need to use the weapon in the first place, thereby minimizing the risk of legal repercussions and ethical compromise. It emphasizes responsible gun ownership and the understanding that carrying a firearm is a last resort, not a license for aggression or preemptive action. An incorrect approach involves reacting solely based on perceived threats that are not imminent or objectively verifiable. This could manifest as profiling individuals based on their appearance, demeanor, or perceived affiliation, leading to an unwarranted sense of danger. Such a reaction is ethically unsound, as it relies on bias rather than objective threat assessment, and is legally problematic, as the right to carry a concealed handgun does not grant the right to act on suspicion alone. Another incorrect approach is to assume a confrontational stance or to actively seek out or provoke potential conflicts, believing that carrying a firearm makes one empowered to do so. This fundamentally misunderstands the purpose of a concealed handgun permit, which is for defensive purposes, not for offensive engagement or intimidation. This approach invites legal trouble and ethical condemnation, as it transforms a defensive tool into an instrument of aggression. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes situational awareness, objective threat assessment, and de-escalation. This involves constantly evaluating the environment for potential risks, considering the totality of circumstances, and always seeking the safest course of action, which often means avoiding confrontation. If a situation appears to be escalating, the primary goal should be to disengage and remove oneself from harm's way. The use of a firearm should only be considered as an absolute last resort when facing an imminent threat of death or serious bodily harm, and when all other options have been exhausted. Question 8. The evaluation methodology shows that a permit holder, after obtaining a Colorado permit to carry a concealed handgun, CCH, is evaluating potential scenarios where their firearm might be carried. Considering the legal framework of Colorado, which of the following best represents a responsible risk assessment for carrying a concealed handgun? Option A. Assuming that a valid CCH permit allows carrying a concealed handgun in most public places, with exceptions only for clearly marked federal buildings. Option B. Continuously reviewing Colorado revised statutes and relevant case law to identify all prohibited locations and circumstances for carrying a concealed handgun, and actively seeking to understand signage and property owner restrictions. Option C. Relying on personal judgment about the general safety of a location to determine if carrying a concealed handgun is appropriate, regardless of specific legal restrictions. Option D. Believing that the right to self-defense supersedes any legal restrictions on carrying a concealed handgun in locations not explicitly designated as gun-free zones by federal law. The correct answer is B. Continuously reviewing Colorado revised statutes and relevant case law to identify all prohibited locations and circumstances for carrying a concealed handgun, and actively seeking to understand signage and property owner restrictions. Explanation: the evaluation methodology shows that assessing potential risks associated with carrying a concealed handgun requires a nuanced understanding of legal obligations and responsible decision-making. This scenario is professionally challenging because it forces an individual to balance their legal right to carry with the paramount responsibility of ensuring public safety and adhering strictly to Colorado revised statutes, C.R.S. concerning concealed carry. Misinterpreting or disregarding these statutes can lead to severe legal consequences and compromise the safety of oneself and others. The best approach involves a proactive and comprehensive understanding of the legal framework governing concealed carry in Colorado. This means not only possessing a valid permit to carry a concealed handgun, CCH, but also continuously educating oneself on the specific locations where carrying is prohibited by law, such as schools, federal buildings, and private property, where the owner has posted signage prohibiting firearms. It also includes understanding the legal ramifications of brandishing or discharging a firearm, even in perceived self-defense, and the importance of de-escalation. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with C.R.S. Section 18-12-106 and related statutes, which mandate that permit holders must be aware of and comply with all restrictions on carrying concealed handguns. Ethical responsibility dictates that a permit holder must act with the utmost diligence to avoid unlawful situations and potential harm. An incorrect approach would be to assume that a valid CCH permit automatically grants unrestricted carry privileges. This fails to acknowledge the numerous statutory exceptions and prohibitions outlined in C.R.S. Section 18-12-106, such as carrying in schools or on federal property, which are critical limitations. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on personal judgment regarding the safety of a location, without verifying if it is legally restricted. This bypasses the legal requirements and introduces a significant risk of violating the law, as personal perception of safety does not override statutory prohibitions. Finally, an approach that prioritizes the perceived right to carry over the legal duty to comply with restrictions, particularly in sensitive locations like schools, demonstrates a severe ethical and legal failing. This disregards the specific legislative intent to protect vulnerable populations and maintain order in such environments. Professional reasoning in such situations requires a commitment to ongoing legal education, a thorough understanding of the specific prohibitions outlined in Colorado law, and a consistent application of these rules in all circumstances. It involves prioritizing legal compliance and public safety over personal convenience or subjective interpretations of rights. Question 9. Quality control measures reveal a scenario where a permit holder, while lawfully carrying a concealed handgun, is involved in a heated verbal argument in a public parking lot. The other individual becomes aggressive, shouting and gesturing menacingly, but does not physically touch or attempt to physically assault the permit holder. The permit holder feels threatened and believes the situation could escalate. What is the most appropriate course of action for the permit holder in this situation, strictly adhering to Colorado law regarding the use of force and concealed carry? Option A. Maintain a calm demeanor, avoid further engagement, and if possible, disengage from the confrontation by walking away while remaining aware of the surroundings. Option B. Draw the concealed handgun and hold it at the ready while verbally instructing the aggressive individual to back away. Option C. Draw the concealed handgun and display it to the aggressive individual to deter further escalation. Option D. Draw the concealed handgun and point it at the aggressive individual to demonstrate readiness to defend oneself. Correct answer is A. Maintain a calm demeanor, avoid further engagement, and if possible, disengage from the confrontation by walking away, while remaining aware of the surroundings. Explanation: Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves a direct conflict between a citizen's right to self-defense and the legal requirements for carrying a concealed handgun. The individual's perceived threat, while real to them, must be assessed against objective legal standards and the specific circumstances permitted by Colorado law for brandishing or displaying a firearm. Misjudging this situation can lead to severe legal consequences, including criminal charges, and compromise public safety. The core challenge lies in distinguishing between a legitimate act of self-defense and an unlawful display of a weapon. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves de-escalating the situation and avoiding any action that could be construed as brandishing or threatening. This means refraining from drawing or displaying the concealed handgun unless there is an immediate, unavoidable threat of death or serious bodily harm, as defined by Colorado Revised Statutes, C.R.S. Section 18-1-704. The individual should prioritize disengagement and seeking assistance from law enforcement if possible, rather than escalating the confrontation by revealing their weapon. This approach aligns with the principle of using deadly force only as a last resort and adhering strictly to the legal parameters of self-defense. Incorrect approaches analysis. Displaying the handgun to intimidate the individual, even if the individual feels threatened, is an unlawful display of a weapon under C.R.S. Section 18-12-109. This action escalates the situation and creates a risk of further violence, potentially leading to criminal charges for the permit holder. It fails to meet the legal threshold for self-defense. Drawing the handgun and pointing it at the individual without an immediate threat of death or serious bodily harm is also a violation of self-defense laws and potentially C.R.S. Section 18-12-109. The law requires an imminent danger, not just a feeling of being threatened or a verbal altercation. This action constitutes an unlawful threat of force. Calling the police and then immediately drawing the handgun to wait for their arrival, without an immediate threat, is an unnecessary escalation. While calling the police is appropriate, drawing the weapon prematurely can be interpreted as an aggressive act and may lead to unintended consequences if the situation is resolved before law enforcement arrives, or if the drawn weapon is perceived as a threat by others or the responding officers. Professional reasoning. Professionals in situations involving potential threats and the carrying of firearms must adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes de-escalation, adherence to legal statutes, and the avoidance of unnecessary force. This involves a continuous assessment of the threat level against the legal definitions of self-defense. The primary goal is to ensure personal safety while strictly complying with the law and minimizing the risk of harm to oneself and others. When in doubt, disengagement and seeking professional assistance, law enforcement, are the safest and most legally sound options. Question 10. Risk assessment procedures indicate that in a particular jurisdiction, the average rate of critical incidents involving concealed handguns is 0.00005 per hour of carry. If an individual plans to carry a concealed handgun for 8 hours per day, 5 days per week, for a period of 52 weeks, what is the probability of at least one critical incident occurring during their total carry time, assuming the rate remains constant and incidents are independent events? Option A. Calculate the total hours of carry. Determine the average rate of incidents per total carry hours \lambda\, and then compute the probability of at least one incident using the formula \1e\lambda\. Option B. Divide the average incident rate per hour by the total number of hours of carry. Option C. Sum the average incident rate per hour and multiply by the total number of days the individual carries. Option D. Multiply the average incident rate per hour by the number of days the individual carries, and then divide by the number of weeks. The correct answer is A. Calculate the total hours of carry. Determine the average rate of incidents per total carry hours \lambda\, and then compute the probability of at least one incident using the formula \1e\lambda\. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the applicant to not only understand the theoretical aspects of firearm safety and legal use, but also to apply mathematical principles to a practical safety scenario. The challenge lies in translating abstract risk probabilities into concrete decision-making criteria, ensuring the applicant can quantitatively assess the safety of a situation beyond subjective feelings. This demands a level of analytical rigor that goes beyond simple memorization of rules. Correct approach analysis. The best approach involves calculating the probability of a critical incident occurring within a defined time frame, using the provided rates and a standard probability formula. This method directly quantifies the risk based on empirical data and established statistical principles. Specifically, it uses the Poisson distribution, a common tool for modeling the number of events occurring in a fixed interval of time or space, given a known average rate of occurrence. The formula for the probability of exactly k events in a Poisson distribution is \p x equals k equals \frac e \lambda kk where lambda is the average rate of events. In this context, we are interested in the probability of at least one critical incident, which is 1p x equals 0 For k equals 0 the formula simplifies to p x equals 0 equals e lambda . Therefore, the probability of at least one incident is 1 e lambda . This approach is correct because it provides an objective, data-driven assessment of risk, aligning with the principle of making informed decisions based on quantifiable evidence, which is a cornerstone of responsible firearm ownership and risk management. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves simply averaging the incident rates without considering the temporal aspect or the probability of multiple events. This fails to account for the cumulative risk over time and the possibility of a critical incident occurring even if the average rate seems low. It's a superficial calculation that doesn't reflect the actual likelihood of an event. Another incorrect approach might be to use a simple linear extrapolation of incidents over a longer period without acknowledging that the probability of an event occurring increases with time, and that events are not always linearly distributed. This ignores the probabilistic nature of risk and can lead to an underestimation of danger. A further incorrect approach could be to focus solely on the number of incidents per year without converting it to a rate per unit of time relevant to the decision-making context, e.g., per hour or per day of carry. This lack of appropriate unit conversion renders the calculation meaningless for assessing risk during a specific carry period. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach risk assessment by first identifying the relevant data, incident rates, timeframes. They should then select appropriate mathematical models that accurately reflect the nature of the risk, e.g., Poisson for rare events over time. Calculations should be performed meticulously, ensuring correct units and formulas are used. Finally, the results should be interpreted in the context of the decision being made, understanding that probabilities represent likelihoods, not certainties, and should inform a cautious and responsible approach to carrying a concealed handgun. Question 11. The monitoring system shows a CCH permit holder's firearm holster shifting, causing the grip of the handgun to become partially visible beneath their jacket in a crowded shopping mall. What is the most appropriate immediate action for the permit holder to take? Option A. Discreetly and smoothly adjust their clothing to reconceal the firearm without drawing attention. Option B. Continue shopping as if nothing has happened, hoping the visibility is minimal. Option C. Immediately remove the firearm from the holster and place it in a bag to reduce visibility. Option D. Loudly announce that their firearm has shifted and they are adjusting it. Correct answer is A. Discreetly and smoothly adjust their clothing to reconceal the firearm without drawing attention. Explanation. The monitoring system demonstrates a potential lapse in judgment regarding the responsible handling of a firearm in a public space, which is a critical area for permit to carry a concealed handgun, CCH, holders. The challenge lies in balancing the right to self-defense with the paramount duty to ensure public safety and adhere strictly to legal parameters. A CCH holder must always be aware of their surroundings and the legal implications of their actions, especially when a firearm is involved. The correct approach involves immediate and responsible action to rectify the situation while minimizing any potential alarm or threat to the public. This means discreetly and safely securing the firearm in a manner that is both compliant with Colorado law and demonstrates a commitment to public safety. Specifically, if a firearm becomes visible due to a malfunction or shifting of clothing, the CCH holder's immediate priority is to reconceal it without drawing undue attention or creating a perception of threat. This aligns with the ethical obligation of a CCH holder to act with a high degree of responsibility and to avoid any action that could be misconstrued as aggressive or negligent. Colorado law emphasizes that a permit to carry a concealed handgun does not grant the right to openly display a firearm or to create a public disturbance. An incorrect approach would be to ignore the situation, hoping it resolves itself without intervention. This fails to address the immediate risk of the firearm being perceived as a threat and violates the CCH holder's duty of care. Another incorrect approach would be to react with panic or to attempt to reconceal the firearm in a hasty or conspicuous manner, which could inadvertently draw more attention and cause alarm, potentially leading to a misunderstanding or a call to law enforcement. Furthermore, attempting to adjust the firearm in a way that draws attention to it, such as fumbling with clothing or the holster in a visible and agitated way, is also professionally unacceptable as it can create a perception of imminent danger. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes safety, legality, and discretion. This involves a continuous assessment of the environment, understanding the legal requirements for carrying a concealed handgun, and maintaining a calm and controlled demeanor. In situations where a firearm becomes inadvertently exposed, the immediate and most responsible action is to discreetly and safely re-establish concealment, thereby upholding both legal obligations and the public trust placed in CCH permit holders. Question 12. Performance analysis shows a permit holder for a concealed handgun arrives at private retail establishment and observes clear signage at all entrances stating "No firearms allowed." The permit holder is legally licensed to carry a concealed handgun in Colorado. What is the most appropriate course of action for the permit holder? Option A. Ignore the signage and proceed with their shopping, believing their permit overrides private property restrictions. Option B. Remain on the premises but ensure the firearm is exceptionally well concealed to avoid detection. Option C. Immediately exit the premises and seek an alternative location to conduct their business. Option D. Enter the establishment and attempt to explain to management that their permit allows them to carry a firearm. The correct answer is C. Immediately exit the premises and seek an alternative location to conduct their business. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge involving a potential conflict between a permit holder's right to carry a concealed handgun and the property owner's right to prohibit firearms on their private premises. Navigating this situation requires careful judgment to uphold legal rights while respecting private property boundaries and de-escalating potential confrontations. The permit holder must understand the scope of their permit and the limitations imposed by private property signage. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves immediately and respectfully complying with the posted signage. This approach acknowledges the property owner's right to control their premises and avoids any potential legal repercussions or confrontations. Colorado law, specifically CRS 18-12-106, outlines the places where a concealed handgun may not be carried, including private property, where the owner has given notice that firearms are prohibited. This notice can be in the form of signage. By choosing to leave the premises, the permit holder is acting in accordance with these regulations and demonstrating responsible firearm ownership. Incorrect approach is analysis. Choosing to ignore the signage and remain on the property, even if the permit holder believes their permit supersedes the signage, is a direct violation of Colorado law and the property owner's rights. This action could lead to being asked to leave by law enforcement, potential trespassing charges, and revocation of the concealed handgun permit. Attempting to argue with the property owner or store employees about the validity of the signage or the permit holder's rights is unprofessional and escalates the situation unnecessarily. This approach demonstrates a lack of understanding of property rights and can lead to a hostile encounter, potentially involving law enforcement. Concealing the firearm more effectively to avoid detection after seeing the signage is a deliberate attempt to circumvent the law and the property owner's wishes. This is a serious ethical and legal failing, as it undermines the integrity of the permit system and shows disrespect for private property rights, potentially leading to severe legal consequences. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such situations with a mindset of de-escalation and compliance. The decision-making process should prioritize understanding and adhering to posted regulations and property rights. If faced with conflicting information or perceived rights, the safest and most professional course of action is to err on the side of caution and compliance with posted rules, especially when those rules are legally enforceable. The permit to carry a concealed handgun grants the right to carry in many places, but it does not grant the right to disregard lawful restrictions on private property. Question 13. Comparative studies suggest that individuals carrying concealed handguns under a Colorado permit often face complex scenarios. Considering the legal framework for self-defense in Colorado, which of the following actions best reflects responsible and lawful conduct when confronted by an individual who is verbally aggressive and making aggressive physical gestures, but not yet physically attacking? Option A. Maintain situational awareness. Assess the imminence and severity of the threat, and if safely possible, create distance or de-escalate the situation without drawing the firearm. Option B. Immediately draw the concealed handgun and issue a stern verbal warning to deter further aggression. Option C. Conceal the firearm but prepare to use it defensively if the individual continues their aggressive verbalizations, regardless of whether a physical attack has commenced. Option D. Use the concealed handgun to physically push the aggressive individual away, thereby preventing a potential physical altercation. The correct answer is A. Maintain situational awareness, assess the imminence and severity of the threat, and if safely possible, create distance or de-escalate the situation without drawing the firearm. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to balance their right to self-defense with the legal obligations and responsibilities associated with carrying a concealed handgun in Colorado. The core difficulty lies in discerning the appropriate level of force and the legal justification for its use, especially when faced with a perceived threat that may not be immediately life-threatening but could escalate. Understanding the nuances of the imminent danger standard and the duty to retreat, or lack thereof in certain Colorado contexts, is crucial for avoiding legal repercussions and ensuring responsible firearm handling. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough understanding and strict adherence to Colorado Revised Statutes, CRS, concerning the use of deadly force and the permit to carry a concealed handgun. This approach prioritizes de-escalation whenever safely possible, assessing the totality of the circumstances to determine if the threat is indeed imminent and unavoidable, and only then employing the minimum force necessary to neutralize the threat. Specifically, this means recognizing that while Colorado law generally permits the use of deadly force to prevent death or serious bodily harm to oneself or another, it does not grant a license to use a firearm for intimidation or in situations where retreat is a safe and viable option, even if not legally mandated in all circumstances. The permit holder must act with restraint and a clear, objective understanding of the legal boundaries of self-defense. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately drawing a concealed handgun and issuing verbal threats upon perceiving any form of aggression or confrontation, even if the threat is not immediate or life-threatening. This fails to meet the legal standard of imminent danger required for the lawful use of deadly force and could be construed as brandishing or assault, violating CRS 18-12-103 and potentially other statutes. It demonstrates a lack of judgment and an overreaction, prioritizing a display of force over a measured response. Another incorrect approach is to use a concealed handgun to prevent minor property damage or to assert dominance in a non-violent dispute. This is a clear violation of the principles of self-defense, which are predicated on the prevention of death or serious bodily harm. Such an action would expose the individual to severe criminal charges, including aggravated assault or even homicide, and would demonstrate a profound misunderstanding of the legal and ethical responsibilities of carrying a firearm. A third incorrect approach is to rely solely on the fact that one possesses a permit to carry a concealed handgun as justification for any use of the weapon. The permit grants the legal right to carry, not an unfettered right to use the firearm in any situation. This approach ignores the critical legal standards for the use of deadly force, such as imminence and necessity, and can lead to unlawful use of force, even if the weapon was legally carried. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a calm assessment of the situation. This involves identifying the nature and imminence of any threat. If a threat is perceived, the individual should consider all safe and reasonable options, including de-escalation and retreat, before contemplating the use of force. If the use of force becomes necessary, the decision to employ a firearm must be based on a genuine and reasonable belief that it is the only means to prevent imminent death or serious bodily harm. This judgment must be grounded in a solid understanding of Colorado's self-defense laws and the ethical responsibilities of firearm ownership. Question 14. The investigation demonstrates a permit holder for a concealed handgun in Colorado is in a crowded public park. While observing a minor verbal dispute between two other individuals nearby, the permit holder feels a slight sense of unease. What is the most appropriate and professional course of action for the permit holder to take regarding their concealed handgun? Option A. Partially expose the firearm to signal their preparedness and deter further escalation of the nearby dispute. Option B. Verbally announce that they are legally carrying a concealed handgun and are prepared to intervene if necessary. Option C. Approach the individuals involved in the dispute and inform them that they are armed and legally permitted to carry. Option D. Discreetly adjust their clothing to ensure the firearm remains completely concealed and remain observant of the surroundings without engaging. The correct answer is D. Discreetly adjust their clothing to ensure the firearm remains completely concealed and remain observant of the surroundings without engaging. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to navigate the delicate balance between exercising a legal right and ensuring public safety and responsible firearm ownership. The core difficulty lies in interpreting the intent and scope of Colorado's concealed handgun laws when faced with a situation that, while not explicitly prohibited, could be perceived as creating a risk or discomfort to others. The individual must demonstrate sound judgment, awareness of their surroundings, and a commitment to upholding the spirit of the law, not just its letter. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves prioritizing de-escalation and minimizing potential alarm or perceived threat. This means holstering the firearm discreetly and avoiding any actions that could be interpreted as aggressive or confrontational. Colorado law permits carrying a concealed handgun, but responsible permit holders are expected to act in a manner that does not unnecessarily draw attention or create a public disturbance. The focus should be on maintaining the concealed nature of the weapon and avoiding any display that could lead to misunderstanding or panic, thereby upholding the public trust associated with the permit. Incorrect approaches analysis. Displaying the firearm openly, even if the intent is to show it is legally carried, is a failure to adhere to the concealed aspect of the permit and can cause undue alarm. This directly contradicts the purpose of a concealed carry permit, which is to allow for discreet carrying. Drawing attention to the firearm in a public, non-threatening situation is unprofessional and potentially escalates a non-issue into a problem, violating the expectation of responsible and discreet firearm carriage. Engaging in a verbal debate with the individual about the legality of carrying the firearm, while potentially feeling justified, is also an inappropriate response. It shifts the focus from responsible concealment to confrontation and can escalate tensions unnecessarily. The permit holder's responsibility is to carry discreetly, not to educate or debate others about their rights in a public setting. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes safety, discretion, and adherence to the spirit of the law. This involves assessing the situation for any immediate threat, considering the potential impact of their actions on others, and choosing the response that best maintains public order and personal safety while respecting legal rights. When in doubt, the safest and most professional course of action is to err on the side of discretion and de-escalation, ensuring the firearm remains concealed and no unnecessary attention is drawn to it. Question 15. Regulatory review indicates that a Colorado permit to carry a concealed handgun holder is walking through a public park and observes a group of individuals behaving in a manner that makes them feel uneasy and potentially threatened, though no overt aggressive actions are being taken against them. What is the most appropriate course of action for the permit holder? Option A. Disengage from the situation by moving away. If the perceived threat persists or escalates, contact law enforcement. Option B. Ignore the situation entirely and continue their walk without any further observation or action. Option C. Approach the individuals to verbally warn them about their behavior and the potential consequences. Option D. Draw their concealed handgun to deter the individuals and make their presence known as a permit holder. Correct answer is A. Disengage from the situation by moving away, and if the perceived threat persists or escalates, contact law enforcement. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to navigate the complex interplay between personal rights, public safety, and the specific legal requirements for carrying a concealed handgun in Colorado. The individual's perception of a threat, while potentially valid, must be evaluated against objective legal standards and the practical implications of their actions. Misinterpreting the legal framework or acting impulsively can lead to severe legal consequences and compromise public safety. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any action taken is both legally permissible and ethically sound. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves immediately disengaging from the situation and contacting law enforcement if a perceived threat exists that cannot be immediately and lawfully neutralized. This approach prioritizes de-escalation and allows trained professionals to assess and manage the situation. It aligns with the principle of using deadly force only as a last resort when there is an imminent threat of death or serious bodily harm, and it respects the legal boundaries of self-defense. By not drawing the concealed weapon, the individual avoids escalating the situation and potential legal ramifications associated with brandishing a firearm without immediate justification under Colorado law. Incorrect approaches analysis. Acting on the perceived threat by drawing the concealed handgun and confronting the individuals, even if the intent is to deter them, is a regulatory and ethical failure. Colorado law requires that a permit holder only draw their concealed handgun when it is necessary for self-defense against an imminent threat of death or serious bodily harm. Drawing the weapon in this scenario, without such an immediate threat, could be construed as brandishing and lead to criminal charges, regardless of the permit status. It also escalates a potentially manageable situation into a dangerous confrontation. Approaching the individuals to verbally warn them about their behavior, while seemingly proactive, also presents a regulatory and ethical failure. This action, while not involving the drawing of a weapon, still involves engaging with individuals who may be unpredictable or hostile. It could provoke a confrontation that the permit holder is not legally justified in escalating, and it places the permit holder in a position of potential liability if the interaction turns violent. The permit is for carrying concealed, not for acting as an informal law enforcement officer. Ignoring the situation and continuing to walk away without any further action, while seemingly passive, could be considered a missed opportunity to ensure personal safety if the perceived threat were to materialize. However, in the context of the other options, it is less of a direct regulatory violation than drawing a weapon or engaging in a verbal confrontation without immediate justification. The primary failure here is a lack of proactive safety assessment, but it avoids the more severe legal pitfall of the other incorrect approaches. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes de-escalation and adherence to legal statutes. This involves 1. Situational awareness, continuously assessing the environment for potential threats. 2. Threat assessment, objectively evaluating the imminence and severity of any perceived threat against legal standards for self-defense. 3. Legal compliance, understanding and strictly adhering to the specific requirements of the Colorado concealed handgun permit laws, particularly regarding the lawful use of a firearm. 4. De-escalation, prioritizing non-confrontational methods to resolve or avoid conflict. 5. Law enforcement engagement, recognizing when a situation requires the intervention of trained professionals and contacting them promptly. Question 16. The analysis reveals that a permit holder for a concealed handgun in Colorado is in a public park when an individual begins shouting aggressively and approaching them in a threatening manner, though not making direct physical contact. What is the most responsible and legally sound course of action for the permit holder? Option A. Brandish the concealed handgun to intimidate the aggressor and force them to back down. Option B. Immediately draw the concealed handgun to deter the aggressive individual from further action. Option C. Engage verbally with the aggressor, matching their aggressive tone to assert dominance. Option D. Attempt to de-escalate the situation verbally and create distance if possible, only drawing the firearm if the aggressor makes a direct physical move indicating imminent harm. The correct answer is D. Attempt to de-escalate the situation verbally and create distance if possible, only drawing the firearm if the aggressor makes a direct physical move indicating imminent harm. Explanation. The analysis reveals a scenario where an individual with a valid Colorado permit to carry a concealed handgun, CCH, encounters a situation requiring immediate judgment regarding their rights and responsibilities in a potentially volatile environment. The professional challenge lies in balancing the legal right to carry a concealed handgun with the ethical imperative to de-escalate conflict and avoid unnecessary use of force, all while adhering strictly to Colorado revised statutes concerning concealed carry. Careful judgment is required to navigate the nuances of self-defense laws and the responsibilities that accompany carrying a firearm. The best professional approach involves prioritizing de-escalation and situational awareness, only resorting to drawing the firearm as a last resort when facing an imminent threat of death or serious bodily harm. This approach aligns with the principles of responsible gun ownership and the legal framework of self-defense in Colorado, which emphasizes proportionality and necessity. By seeking to disengage or de-escalate, the individual acts in accordance with the spirit of the law, which permits carrying a concealed handgun for self-defense, but does not mandate its use in every perceived threat. This proactive stance minimizes the risk of unintended escalation and potential legal repercussions. An incorrect approach would be to immediately draw the firearm upon perceiving a verbal threat or aggressive posturing, without assessing the immediate danger of physical harm. This action could be construed as an escalation rather than a defensive measure, potentially violating the imminent threat requirement of Colorado's self-defense statutes. Another incorrect approach would be to brandish the firearm to intimidate the aggressor, as this constitutes an unlawful display of a weapon and can lead to criminal charges, irrespective of the initial provocation. Furthermore, failing to retreat when safely possible in a situation that does not involve an imminent threat of death or serious bodily harm, and instead engaging further, would also be professionally unsound and potentially legally problematic under Colorado law. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough assessment of the threat, prioritizing de-escalation and avoidance. This involves actively seeking to disengage from the situation if safe to do so. If de-escalation or avoidance is not possible, and an imminent threat of death or serious bodily harm is present, then drawing the firearm for self-defense becomes a justifiable option. Throughout this process, maintaining situational awareness and understanding the legal boundaries of self-defense are paramount. Question 17. When evaluating a situation where an individual is carrying a concealed handgun under a Colorado permit to carry a concealed handgun, CCH, which of the following best reflects the legally and ethically permissible use of that firearm? Option A. Using the firearm only when there is a reasonable belief that it is immediately necessary to prevent imminent death or serious bodily injury to oneself or another person, and all other reasonable means of escape or de-escalation have been exhausted or are unavailable. Option B. Using the firearm to deter an individual who is verbally aggressive and making threats, even if there is no immediate physical danger. Option C. Displaying the firearm to an individual who is blocking one's path and refusing to move, as a means of asserting one's right to pass. Option D. Using the firearm against someone who has committed a past offense against the carrier, if the carrier believes the individual might pose a future threat. The correct answer is A. Using the firearm only when there is a reasonable belief that it is immediately necessary to prevent imminent death or serious bodily injury to oneself or another person, and all other reasonable means of escape or de-escalation have been exhausted or are unavailable. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to balance their right to self-defense with the legal obligations and responsibilities associated with carrying a concealed handgun in Colorado. The core difficulty lies in accurately assessing a situation to determine if the use of deadly force is legally justified, while also considering the potential legal and ethical ramifications of their actions. Misjudgment can lead to severe legal consequences, including criminal charges and significant personal distress. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough understanding and strict adherence to Colorado revised statutes, CRS, concerning the use of deadly force. Specifically, CRS Section 18-1-704 outlines the justifiable use of physical force, including deadly physical force, when a person reasonably believes it is necessary to prevent imminent death or serious bodily injury to themselves or another person, or to prevent the commission of a felony. This approach requires an objective assessment of the threat, focusing on whether a reasonable person in the same circumstances would perceive an imminent danger. It emphasizes de-escalation and avoidance of force whenever possible, resorting to deadly force only as a last resort when all other reasonable options have been exhausted or are unavailable. This aligns with the legal framework that permits self-defense, but does not condone preemptive or excessive force. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves assuming that any perceived threat, regardless of its immediacy or severity, justifies the use of a concealed handgun. This fails to meet the imminent death or serious bodily injury standard established by Colorado law. It can lead to the unlawful use of force based on fear or assumption, rather than a concrete, immediate danger. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on the fact that one possesses a permit to carry a concealed handgun, CCH, as a blanket justification for using their weapon in any confrontational situation. The permit grants the legal right to carry concealed, but it does not grant the right to use the weapon outside the strict parameters of self-defense as defined by law. This approach ignores the critical legal thresholds for justifiable force. A further incorrect approach is to use the concealed handgun to intimidate or threaten an individual who poses no immediate physical danger, even if the individual is acting provocatively or offensively. This constitutes an unlawful display of a weapon and can lead to criminal charges, as it goes beyond the scope of self-defense and enters the realm of assault or coercion. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance and ethical responsibility. This involves continuous training on the legal statutes governing the use of force in Colorado, including C.R.S. Section 18-1-704. It also necessitates developing situational awareness and de-escalation skills. In any potentially volatile situation, the primary objective should be to disengage or de-escalate if safely possible. If force becomes necessary, the decision to use deadly force must be based on a clear, objective assessment of an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury, and it must be the minimum force necessary to neutralize that threat. Documentation and reporting of any incident involving the use of a firearm are also crucial steps. Question 18. Which approach would be most aligned with Colorado's legal and ethical standards for carrying a concealed handgun when encountering a situation where an individual feels threatened but the threat is not immediately overt? Option A. Assess the situation based on the totality of the circumstances to determine if there is a reasonable belief of imminent death or serious bodily injury, and only consider the use of force if such a belief is objectively justifiable. Option B. Rely on personal intuition and a general sense of danger to justify the potential use of the concealed handgun, even without concrete evidence of an imminent threat. Option C. Immediately draw and display the concealed handgun to deter any potential aggressor based on a subjective feeling of unease. Option D. Assume that any perceived threat, regardless of its immediacy, warrants the preparation to use deadly force to ensure personal safety. The correct answer is A. Assess the situation based on the totality of the circumstances to determine if there is a reasonable belief of imminent death or serious bodily injury, and only consider the use of force if such a belief is objectively justifiable. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to balance their right to self-defense with the legal and ethical responsibilities associated with carrying a concealed handgun in Colorado. The core of the challenge lies in understanding the nuances of when and how force may be legally and ethically justified, particularly when the threat is perceived but not immediately overt. Misjudgment can lead to severe legal consequences and ethical breaches. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves a thorough understanding and strict adherence to Colorado Revised Statutes, C.R.S., concerning the use of deadly physical force. This means recognizing that the legal justification for using deadly force is the reasonable belief that such force is necessary to prevent imminent death or serious bodily injury to oneself or another person. It requires an objective assessment of the circumstances, not merely a subjective feeling of fear. The individual must be able to articulate, based on the totality of the circumstances, why their belief was reasonable at the moment force was considered or used. This aligns with C.R.S. 18-1-704, which outlines the justification for using physical force, including deadly force, when a person reasonably believes it is necessary to prevent imminent death or serious bodily injury. Ethical considerations also demand restraint and the avoidance of force unless absolutely necessary. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves relying solely on a subjective feeling of unease or a general sense of danger without a concrete, imminent threat. This fails to meet the legal standard of reasonable belief that imminent death or serious bodily injury is occurring or will occur. Colorado law requires more than mere apprehension. It demands a reasonable perception of an immediate danger. Another incorrect approach is to assume that any perceived threat, regardless of its immediacy or severity, justifies the use of a concealed handgun. This disregards the legal requirement for imminent danger and the proportionality of force. It can lead to the unlawful use of force and potential criminal charges. A further incorrect approach is to brandish or display a concealed handgun as a warning or to intimidate someone, even if no physical force is ultimately used. This action itself can be considered unlawful and may escalate a situation unnecessarily, potentially leading to charges of menacing or disorderly conduct, and it does not align with the responsible and lawful carrying of a concealed handgun. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes de-escalation and avoidance of conflict. When faced with a potential threat, the primary considerations should be: 1. Is there an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury? 2. Is the use of deadly force the only reasonable means to prevent that imminent threat? 3. Can I articulate the objective facts that led to this reasonable belief? This framework emphasizes legal compliance, ethical responsibility, and the preservation of life and safety. Question 19. What factors determine the appropriateness of carrying a concealed handgun into a private retail establishment in Colorado when the establishment's policy on firearms is not immediately apparent? Option A. Proactively inquiring with the establishment's management or staff about their specific policy regarding firearms before making a purchase. Option B. Immediately leaving the establishment upon entering if a "No Firearms" sign is not prominently displayed at the entrance. Option C. Proceeding to carry the concealed handgun into the establishment without any inquiry, relying on the absence of visible signage prohibiting firearms. Option D. Assuming that carrying a concealed handgun is permissible in any private establishment, as long as one possesses a valid Colorado permit to carry a concealed handgun. The correct answer is A. Proactively inquiring with the establishment's management or staff about their specific policy regarding firearms before making a purchase. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for permit holders, navigating the nuances of where a concealed handgun may legally be carried, particularly in private establishments that may have varying policies. The professional challenge lies in balancing the legal right to carry with the rights of private property owners to set their own rules, while also ensuring compliance with Colorado Revised Statutes, CRS, concerning concealed carry. Misinterpreting these rights or failing to ascertain the establishment's policy can lead to legal repercussions or conflicts. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves proactively seeking information about the establishment's policy regarding firearms. This approach demonstrates respect for private property rights and a commitment to adhering to both the letter of the law and the specific rules of a location. Colorado law, specifically CRS 18-12-106, outlines prohibited places for carrying firearms, but it also allows private property owners to post signs prohibiting firearms or to verbally inform individuals. Therefore, inquiring about the policy before entering or making a purchase is the most responsible and legally sound action. This proactive step ensures the permit holder acts with full awareness and avoids potential violations. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that because a permit to carry is held, carrying a concealed handgun is permissible in all private establishments. This fails to acknowledge the right of private property owners to prohibit firearms on their premises, as permitted by Colorado law. It can lead to a violation of CRS 18-12-106 if the establishment has indeed prohibited firearms. Another incorrect approach is to proceed with carrying the concealed handgun without making any attempt to ascertain the establishment's policy, especially if there are no visible signs. While the absence of a sign might suggest permissibility, it does not negate the owner's right to verbally prohibit firearms. This can result in an unintended violation if the owner or an agent of the owner later informs the permit holder that firearms are not allowed. A third incorrect approach is to leave the establishment immediately upon noticing a "no firearms" sign, without considering any alternative actions or seeking clarification. A leaving is a correct response if the policy is known and the permit holder wishes to comply. The initial failure to inquire about the policy, if it was not immediately apparent, is the primary oversight. The best practice is to inquire before entering, or making a purchase if the policy is not clear. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance and respect for property rights. This involves 1. Understanding the scope of their permit and the general prohibitions outlined in CRS. 2. Recognizing that private property owners have rights to regulate firearms on their property. 3. Proactively seeking information about establishment policies when ambiguity exists, especially in private businesses. 4. Acting in accordance with the established policy, which may involve leaving the firearm secured elsewhere or not entering the establishment. This layered approach ensures responsible firearm ownership and adherence to all applicable laws and regulations. Question 20. The risk matrix shows a moderate probability of encountering a situation where a permit holder might feel threatened, with a high potential for severe consequences if a firearm is discharged. Given these parameters, which of the following represents the most prudent and legally compliant course of action for a Colorado permit to carry a concealed handgun holder? Option A. Engage verbally with the perceived aggressor to assert authority and demonstrate preparedness to use the concealed weapon if necessary. Option B. Draw the firearm defensively as soon as a potential threat is perceived, to deter further aggression and establish a position of advantage. Option C. Assume that the presence of the concealed handgun is sufficient to deter most threats and continue with the original activity, only reacting if directly attacked. Option D. Prioritize de-escalation and avoidance, seeking to create distance or disengage from the situation if safely possible, and only considering the use of the firearm as an absolute last resort when facing an imminent threat of death or serious bodily harm. The correct answer is D. Prioritize de-escalation and avoidance, seeking to create distance or disengage from the situation if safely possible, and only considering the use of the firearm as an absolute last resort when facing an imminent threat of death or serious bodily harm. Explanation. The risk matrix shows a potential for increased liability for the permit holder due to a combination of factors: a high likelihood of encountering a stressful situation and a moderate severity of consequences if a firearm is discharged inappropriately. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the permit holder to not only understand the legal parameters of concealed carry, but also to apply probabilistic reasoning to assess and mitigate risks in real-world, dynamic environments. The core of the challenge lies in translating abstract legal knowledge into practical, life-saving decisions under duress. The best professional approach involves a proactive and conservative risk management strategy. This means prioritizing de-escalation and avoidance of conflict above all else, recognizing that even a legally justified use of force carries significant legal, emotional, and financial repercussions. Specifically, this approach would involve assessing the situation for opportunities to disengage or create distance, utilizing verbal de-escalation techniques if safe to do so, and only considering the use of a firearm as an absolute last resort when facing an imminent threat of death or serious bodily harm, as defined by Colorado law. This aligns with the ethical imperative to preserve life and minimize harm, and the legal framework which permits concealed carry for self-defense, but does not mandate or encourage its use in non-life-threatening situations. An incorrect approach would be to assume that possessing a permit automatically grants the right to draw a firearm in any situation perceived as a threat, regardless of its immediacy or severity. This fails to acknowledge the nuanced legal standard of imminent threat and the ethical responsibility to avoid unnecessary force. Another incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the presence of a firearm as a deterrent, leading to a heightened sense of security that might encourage engagement in potentially dangerous situations rather than avoidance. This overlooks the fact that a firearm is a tool of last resort, and its mere presence does not negate the need for careful situational assessment and de-escalation. A further incorrect approach would be to prioritize personal comfort or perceived disrespect over the legal and ethical standards for firearm use, leading to an impulsive or retaliatory drawing of a weapon. This demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of the grave responsibility that comes with carrying a concealed handgun. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough situational assessment, focusing on identifying threats and opportunities for safe disengagement. This should be followed by a consideration of de-escalation tactics, if feasible and safe. Only after exhausting these options, and when facing an imminent threat of death or serious bodily harm, should the use of a firearm be contemplated. Always in strict adherence to Colorado revised statutes concerning the use of deadly force. This layered approach ensures that the permit holder acts within legal boundaries and ethical considerations, prioritizing safety and de-escalation.